Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to see you've managed to make your way through the trenches without being injured or wounded, unlike this poor man that you can see lying in front of you. This young chap went over the top and unfortunately got hit by a bullet into his left leg, and later on we're going to try to remove that from him to show you the sort of work that the Royal Army Medical Corps and the nurses from the Queen Alexander's Imperial Military Nursing Service would have done. But I think it's important just to explain to you to begin with the way in which soldiers, casualties, were actually evacuated from the field of battle. Because the army had actually developed a system whereby they could look after their men as well as they possibly could. And each regiment had its own regimental aid post. So if somebody went over the top, they were carried back by stretcher bearers, not their compatriots, because they had to carry on going forward to fight the Germans, but carried back by stretcher bearers to their own lines, where the regimental aid post would look after them. And what does that really mean? It means they stuck a dressing on top. And could I please have a dressing nurse so that we can show colleagues? Each man carried 2 dressings in inside of their jacket. The dressing opens out, so you've got a wad of lint and a bandage tape to wrap round. Can I ask a silly question? Why did the army give them 2? Surely if you're wounded, you've got... Sorry? Have anybody any ideas? Why 2? We might. But of course if you hit with a bullet, the bullet goes in, it also comes out. Not always, as you'll see later. But that's why they had 2. One for the entry wound and one for the exit wound. Once a man had been treated, dressed up, he'd be sent on to an advanced dressing station. And the advanced dressing station would have doctors from the Royal Army Medical Corps that would treat that wound, whatever it might be. That wound, in fact, would be redressed, and that really means putting another dressing over the top to staunch the blood flow, and moved on yet again back to where you are here. And this is the casualty clearing station. And this is the first time that the soldier has actually come back to a base where it's clean. At the regimental aid post, the advanced dressing station, we're in dirty conditions. Just think for a moment about the poor chaps that stayed in the trenches. The army call their toilets the latrines. And what were the latrines in the trenches? Where's it gone? Anybody can guess? It was our bucket, right? So you went to the toilet in the bucket. And of course, when it was full, some poor soul had to empty it. And that meant that somebody was detached to take it to the cesspits behind the lines through the communication trenches and to dump it. But of course, troops always find the easy way of dealing with things, don't they? And what was the easiest way of dealing with the full bucket of you know what? Sling it over the top of the trench into no man's land. Great. It gets rid of it. It's quick. You haven't to walk miles to get rid of it. Put it back and away you go. Great. Until the Germans start shelling. And then what happens? It comes back into the trench. And that puts a whole new meaning on the expression getting your own back. Right? So that's why the conditions outside were not particularly clean. But now we're in sterile conditions, and this young man we're going to be treating now. So don't worry, young chap, we'll soon have you back with your chums in the trench, okay? Mr. Mace, if you'd be good enough to put him under for me, please. Now, the anaesthetic that we're going to use today is simply ether. And ether and chloroform were the 2 general anaesthetics that they use. Our nurses will take the blood pressure to make sure our casualty is okay and stable, while our anaesthetist puts him under. One of the problems with either chloroform or ether, though, was that the muscles actually contracted. So it made the surgeon's job much more difficult to cut through the muscle tissue to get at whatever he was after. They did find later on in the war, though, that if they warmed the ether first, or the chloroform, it helped relax. But you had to be very careful, because if you gave the chap too much, he didn't come back around from the anaesthetic. So it was a trial and error game to begin with. How are we doing, Mr. Mace?
He's getting there.
Getting there, good hope.
Yes.
Now the wound we've got here is just a nice, simple entry wound. And the wound, as you can see, is a nice clean wound. It's gone in. The nurses before you came in have cleaned it and sterilised it for me. And we're going to start now to make an incision and try to probe for the bullet that's in there. One of the unfortunate things, of course, a bullet goes in, but it doesn't necessarily stay where it's supposed to. And the introduction of X-rays were absolutely a godsend to the men in the trenches, because it enabled them to actually locate the bullet before they started, or a piece of shrapnel, whatever it may be.
Okay.
Are we okay? Blood pressure all right now? Okay. Scalpel, please, Matron. Thank you. Oh, this lad's made of tough stuff. Perhaps it's their blades.
We're not getting these things up from the...
Now, the Army
all
Service
the
Corps
equipment's not going
actually
through.
sharpen all our instruments for us. And they're not disposable like today's. So this one is much better. So we've got a nice incision. Probe, please. Right, can we have some retractors just to open it out? And again, thank you. No, Spencer Wells, please, for this one. Thank you. No, Spencer Wells. Right, probe again, please. Are we okay up there?
Yep.
Yep, fine. Forceps now, please. Somewhat stuck into the tissue. And there we go. And there's the bullet that had caused all the problem for this young man. Now, we said earlier on that part of the problem was the dirty conditions in which the soldiers operated. And one of the things which also caused some problems was pieces of uniform and filth that went into the wound. So what I want to do now is to probe yet again, just to see whether there's anything else inside that wound. Ah, yes. Yeah, forceps please again. Thank you. And there we are. Now that's a piece of his uniform that's been pulled in by the bullet. If that had stayed in, then that would have caused infection and he would have probably lost his leg later on. Okay, now if we can suture him up. Thank you. Again, the Service Corps have not been doing their job properly. Perhaps you can get these all resharpened.
If you can't see, you can stand up and have a look, by the way. Get near.
Go on, Rob.
Tie off. And I think that will do on that one, sister. That will do it. Right, nurses, if you could patch that up with the dressing, please. Now that's our chap sorted out. The bullet's being extracted. The piece of uniform has come out, so he's ready. He's now going to receive proper nursing care from our nurses that will deal with him and look after him. But the journey hasn't ended there. Because the first thing we should say is, who do you think would get treated first when they came into a casualty clearing station? If you go to accident and emergency today, who gets treated first? Not necessarily just children. It's the people that are most seriously injured or need much more assistance. On the front line, who got treated first?
Officers and
No, not officers. The man that was least wounded. Why did the least wounded get treated first? We could send them back. So we'd send them back to the front line so they could carry on fighting. Those cases that were unlikely to survive, though, would actually be left to one side. With a bit of luck, a morphine tablet under the tongue and a woodbine, and that would be their lot. But for this young man, and for many others, they had something known as a blighty wound. And England was called Blighty. So they would be taken back to England for a full recovery. He won't be. He'll be staying here in France to actually look after that wound and then be sent back to his regiment. But we developed such a good system of evacuation, regimental aid posts, advanced dressing, casualty clearing, onto base hospitals, where they would have remained. If the wound needed to go back to England for a longer period of recuperation, they'd be sent back with that blighty wound. Question: how long would it take you to get back to England? About 2 miles is a distance, it's a long way, but in France it's even further. So how long do you think it would take? Anybody ideas? Anybody have a guess?
A week.
A week. Pretty good going. Okay. Anybody else? Any advance on a week? 2 weeks, right. Well, would you believe that if this young man had gone over the top at 7 o'clock in the morning, by 7 o'clock that evening he could actually be back in England? Because the evacuation procedure works so quickly. And at the field hospitals, there were hospital trains, ships on the rivers and canals, hospital ships, which took them straight to the ports, at the ports onto steamer, back home to England. When they got back, of course, they'd build hospitals on the south coast to look after them. Sorry, I beg your pardon, I lie. They'd built, they used to put the troops back onto trains and send them back to their local areas from which they came. But it depressed the local civilian population so much because of the number of casualties coming back, that in the end they built hospitals on the south coast so they could contain the casualties there to keep morale up for the local people. Okay? It's for you. Okay. Now, one of the things I would like to just tell you about is a little bit more, and then we'll see if there are any questions, is the young ladies that are helping. Now, at this particular point, we actually have nurses at the casualty clearing station. And what you see here are nurses dressed as Queen Alexander's Imperial Military Nursing Service. Matron here is dressed up in theatre gown because she's been assisting me. Sister here is wearing her working dress. So what she has, long cuffs on the arms to keep the uniform itself clean, working pinafore, belt, small chatelaine. Could you just show that please if you would, sister? Which would carry her scissors, thermometer, etc., her working tools. And she also wears a little cloak called a tippet and a medal. Now that's not really a medal, it's actually a badge to show that she's a trained nurse. But we've got lots of ladies in the room, so now we've got a question just for the ladies. Now, if you could be good enough to lift that up. On the back of the tippet is a little rose, a cloth rose. Now, would you like to do me a favour? Would you like to go and just press that rose for me?
She won't buy it. She's had dinner.
Come around this way, a bit more room. Now there's a reason for asking this young man to do this for me. What's it feel like? It's hard, isn't it? Thank you. Now, that's great, thank you very much. Now that tippet rose has actually got a particular job to do. And of course you're all young ladies, you'll know precisely what that's for, won't you? come now, you must know. You're all ladies, as I said. Anybody like to have a guess? What do you think?
I don't know.
You don't know? Oh, that's no good.
Don't say anything.
Right. What do you mean don't say anything? Come on, it's your turn then. What do you think?
Stop, we're going to sleep.
You're not far wrong. No, anybody like to have a guess? Well, of course, nurses, up until Florence Nightingale, were the lowest of the low. But when Florence Nightingale introduced the nursing section after the Crimea, nurses became very well thought of. They were educated ladies, they were normally quite well off, and they came from good backgrounds. So a lady, of course, must carry herself with a certain amount of deportment. You'd never see a lady leaning against a wall or slouched in a chair, would you? Go on.
Stop her from doing it.
Absolutely. It's to stop her leaning against a wall or slouching in a chair. It's to make her keep herself upright. And the Queen Alexander's Imperial Military Nursing Service changed in
49.
thank you ever so much, to the Queen Alexander's Royal Army Nursing Corps. And on their tippets, they still carry that little tippet rose today as a mark of tradition. Okay, so it's still there. Now, I'm going to close there because I can carry on all night, but any questions from anybody? Not one.
I'd like to say that Rachel got it wrong. It's 52, not
52, there you go. Oh dear, oh dear.
Did you have any disinfectants?
Yes, mainly it was Lysol, wasn't it, at that particular time, and carbolic. We normally have a chunk of carbolic here because it has that wonderful aroma, which is quite characteristic all of itself. So they used to use that.
Used on the wounds or just...
No, they would have used iodine on the wound. They, in fact, used to have carried with the stretcher bearers or the medics that went out with the troops when they went into action, would carry small ampules of iodine. And the little ampule had a little gauze end to it, so they could just simply smash the end of it and apply the iodine. Right?
How serious was the infection after...
Well, that was an immediate way of trying to stop some of the infection. Two things that they would also do in the field, is if the man was in very severe pain, they would pop a grain of morphine underneath his tongue. But to make sure as he went down that evacuation line, he wasn't actually overdosed, they would write on his forehead the letter M. If they'd got tetanus injections with them, they'd give a tetanus injection as well to fight some of the infection that was born within the soil. So they'd write on his forehead MT. MT?
They haven't put the time, they put the time of giving the dose, so they didn't overdose it.
That's right, as he went back down the line. But the question is, what did they actually use to write on his forehead with? Did they carry a indelible pencil? What was there always a plentiful supply of on the battlefield? Blood. So they'd use the man's own blood to write on the forehead MT. When he came to the regimental aid post, though, he would be tagged. And a little card like this, which is a field medical card, would be clipped to his jacket or put in the top pocket, like so. And that carries what treatment has been done to this particular soldier. So as he goes back through the line, whoever picks him up knows precisely what's happened. One of the things that they also found was when they were carrying casualties out of the field, they didn't want to lose the man's kit, so very often as not that went on top of the stretcher with the man. And of course he'd got a rifle. You don't want to lose a rifle, do you? So that would go on the side of the stretcher. And if he'd got a broken leg as a consequence to these injuries, they'd probably strap the rifle to his leg to act as a temporary splint. But unfortunately they found that there was a danger in that, because if a man's in pain, what does he do? Go to grab the part and shoots the stretcher bearer. So what they used to do then, once they discovered that that was a failing in what they tried to do, they'd take the bolt out of the rifle, pop it into the man's top pocket of his jacket, use the rifle, then when he got back to either the regimental aid post or whatever, the rifle would be taken off him, the bolt extracted, they've got a working weapon again. That's it. So that's just a little bit more about what they would have done in the field. Any other questions?
When they lose limbs now,
Sorry?
when they lose limbs now, like legs,
Yes.
they can have them artificial, something artificial. What happened then? Did they live or did they die anyway?
If they were so severe, let's say they'd been hit by a shell and part of the leg had gone, the leg would be amputated. Unlike the naval battles in the 19th century, where they would have a race to actually strip the leg off, cut through the bone, and then whack boiling tar onto the end of the leg, which must have been as painful as them having the leg cut off. They would have actually tied off the arteries and the veins to the leg, extracted it, cut the limb off, and then brought the flesh back to create a pocket over the stump of the leg. Then again, of course, there was issues around the appendage that fit to that prosthesis later on, but that wouldn't be done until he got back to England.
Was that stuff in the farm bottle where you put it in?
That was diethyl ether, commonly called ether, and that's used as an anaesthetic. It'll put him to sleep. All right. They also use
a big mistake with that. I was standing over pouring it in, so we put them to sleep.
Would have put you out as well, probably.
We put them out as well.
We do sometimes say to our anaesthetist, please try to stay awake during the course of the procedure. Because very often as not, with those, they actually could fall asleep because of the ether. It wasn't until 1917 towards 1918 that they actually introduced the Boyle's machine, which is the use of nitrous oxide as an anaesthetic. Put my teeth back in as an anaesthetic. It wasn't until then. Any more questions?
A few things. We did have X-rays then. In fact, X-rays were invented just before the turn of the century, 1900. So come 1915, we actually had a few mobile X-rays that came out of France and Belgium. Obviously they were in field hospitals and that sort of thing.
But they were extremely useful, and a gentleman by the name of Ronston actually produced X-rays initially by bombarding copper or tungsten elements with electrons, and that was a way of producing X-rays, which became a godsend to people in the field, because instead of having to probe all the way through the body to find a bit of shrapnel, they could actually identify where it is and go directly for it, rather than cause untold damage inside the abdomen. Any other questions?
Well, go on, Sophie.
You know if the hairs needed the teeth pulled out, where would they go?
Ah, well, for that, who do you go and see?
Dentist.
Absolutely. And guess what they had? Dentists. So it wouldn't come to me necessarily to have his teeth extracted. It'd go to a dentist that was actually trained in that particular field. Still part of the Royal Army Medical Corps, but they would nevertheless come. Has anybody ever been to France? Been to the battlefields? One of the things that I always love over there is the jars that you see with SRD on them, the rum jars. Every man in the regiment was actually allowed a tot of rum every day. From the RAF, of course. Unless the colonel of the regiment was a Methodist minister or was a teetotaler. But every man was entitled to it. And you heard us mention earlier on where the scalpels weren't particularly sharp, the stretcher needles. They were actually sharpened by the Army Service Corps. And it was also their responsibility to take the rum jars to each of the regiments in the trenches. And SRD stands for Service Rum Dilute. but it was rechristened by the men in the trenches as something else. And it's not rude. Any idea what it was?
Bob?
No, it wasn't that. The men in the trenches christened it seldom reaches destination. Because the men of the Army Service Corps would of course have a little nip on the way down just to make sure that it was okay for the lads in the trench. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Any more questions? And I'll leave it. Another one!
No, Oliver. That's silly.
You're tired.
Tired.
Well, you'll be even
Well,
tired
lie
when you
down
get
on the bed
home.
then and have
All
an
right?
operation.
We can always operate on you later. Yes? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Really good. You like it, didn't it? Oh no.